Now, Mark ends with, but they held their peace. When he looked around about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. So that's the end of the questions. It says they held their peace. Luke doesn't have that. It just says, and looking round about upon them all, he said to the man, stretch forth your hands. So it's more descriptive of what he's experiencing. Matthew, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath days? You know what? That would actually fit after he heals the man. I wonder if it would be okay for me to switch around the order as it says in Matthew and put these extra statements after the healing. But I don't think that would fit, because no, Mark, it says after he healed them, the Pharisees left and immediately took counsel with the Herodians against him. Luke, he heals the man and did so, and his hand was restored whole, and they were filled with madness and communed one with another what they might do to Jesus. But still, in Luke, he's saying, I'll ask you one thing. And then, in Mark, it clearly says they held their peace, which means they didn't answer the question. So it wouldn't make sense to have these verses, these other statements that Jesus is telling them just before they refuse to answer, because that would negate the demand for a response. If I was to just continue after this, how much more is it better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do? And he's saying, it is therefore. Wherefore, same thing as wherefore. It is lawful. He's telling them, it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. If I was to then say in Mark, but they held their peace, it wouldn't be anymore that they refused to answer. It would just be that they didn't argue. They didn't add. Because after these statements, after Jesus is telling them it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, and they say nothing, it's not as much as a silence as when he's specifically asking them, is it good to heal on the Sabbath or to do evil? And still then they don't respond. That's what makes this statement, but they held their peace, have so much weight. The fact that Jesus is specifically asking them a question and they're not answering. Not that he's telling them things and they're not adding or they're not arguing. It's not quite as clear as a refusal to answer when you are questioned. I'm thinking in a court of law scenario. If you are asked a question and you refuse to answer, that, no, that's not seen as an admission of guilt because of the Fifth Amendment. But it's still a form of, would it be contempt? Would that be contempt if you're asked a question and you refuse to answer? But if you're not in a court of law, if you're just in like a church and someone's preaching and you're sitting there silent, that's almost expected nowadays. It's not required. It's not even asked that you respond. If someone's just telling you things, it's not expected that you respond or that you argue. But if someone's questioning you, it is expected that you respond. And I'm just trying to figure out for me to put these verses in Matthew after the healing, even though it's not exactly how it goes, and it's not mentioned in Mark or Luke. And it does say in Matthew, then he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. I know already that Matthew puts the events out of order. And I know that Mark says he's asking this question, and they specifically refuse to respond, which means it would make sense if only the question comes before their refusal to respond. Oh, I know how it could work. I could say he questioned them, they refused to respond. I can continue. And when he looked around about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, I can stop there, pause, and before he says to the man, stretch forth your hand, then he can go into these words. He said to them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day? Then these are his statements after their refusal to answer the question. Then he heals the man. Okay, yeah, there. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. I don't want to reorder it, but it wouldn't work with the question after the statements. Okay, so that's how I'll do it. After this, immediately comes their refusal to answer, but they held their peace. And looking around upon them, he said, okay, so I'm not saying that yet. But they held their peace, and when he looked around about on them, that comes later. So now this is from Mark only. but they held their peace. Now, and when he had looked round about on them with anger, and from Luke, and looking round about upon them all, more description in Mark, I can then say, he said to them, what man? Yeah, and from Matthew and Mark and Luke. So, and from all three. They held their peace. Luke 6:10. And looking round about upon them all. Mark, and when he had looked. So it's either when he had looked or looking. I would like it if this was more in present tense, because from the way that I'm organizing it is that it's all in order in real time, or in the time that it really happened. So it's as if it's reading like a novel where you are right there with Jesus as he is doing these events. And I would wish that I could have more present tense words. So maybe because of that, I'll choose present tense when I have the option. So I could say here in Luke, looking round about upon them all, instead of, and when he had looked round about on them. When he had looked or looking. But see, that runs into the problem because now it would be as if I'm skipping over other words, that I'd be leaving out what was written in one gospel for what was written in another. So I'll just go back to what I always do. I'll keep the majority of the words. When he had looked round about on them with anger, round about upon them all. So round about is both Mark and Luke. Round about upon them all, on them. I could say upon them all with anger. Yeah, I'll do that. Upon Luke only, but I could say the on portion is both. Them all, them. So them is both. All is only Luke. Luke ends there and just goes on to say, he said to them, but Mark has more of an explanation. With anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. So this next portion is only Mark. With anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. Mark finishes, he said to the man. Luke, he said to the man. Okay, that's both. Actually, I think that is where Matthew picks up as well. Oh, no, that's right. That's where I'm going to stop. And I'm going to continue with what's mentioned in Matthew. Before he said to the man. So right after hearts. Okay, right where I am, I'm going to move over to Matthew. And he said to them, what man shall there be among you? He said to them, what man shall there be among you shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. And that's where that ends. And then he goes into, then says he to the man. Mark, he said to the man. Luke, he said to the man. I think I'm going to go with what Mark and Luke say because it's the majority. He said instead of says he. So I'm going to have some kind of introductory word before that. He said to the man, Mark, Matthew, then. This is Matthew only. He said to the man, not says. So I'm going to skip that word in Matthew and go right to what it says in Mark and Luke. He said to the man. He said to the man. Yeah, so this is gray because it's all three. He said is only Mark and Luke, all three. To the man. Matthew ends in a comma. Stretch forth your hand. Mark, comma, stretch forth your hand. Luke, comma, stretch forth your hand. All right, it's the same for all three. Stretch forth your hand, period. Luke, and he did so. Mark, period. And he stretched it out. And he is both, period. And he stretched it forth. And he stretched it out. And he did so. And his hand was. So should I say, and he did so, or he stretched it forth? Or stretched it out, like in Mark? I'm thinking, can I put both? And he did so, and stretched it forth. And he did so, and stretched it forth. Yeah, I think I can do that. I can have both. And he did so, and stretched it forth. Yeah, that would work. Which would mean that "and he did so" is only from Luke, and then "and he stretched it forth" would be the next statement. Or maybe instead of saying "he" twice, I'll say "and he did so and stretched it out." Or should I say "stretched it forth"? Well, either way, I'm definitely putting this statement from Luke first. "And he did so." Between Matthew and Mark, the words "he stretched it" and "he stretched it." Yeah, that's both. Matthew, Mark, and "he stretched it." Both have the word "it" in italics. Now, to choose between did he stretch it out or did he stretch it forth? Jesus told him, "Stretch forth your hand," which makes sense. You go forth. But nowadays we say out. We don't even. I've never heard someone nowadays say forth, ever. Only in books. So because of that, I think I'm going to go with out. And for the similar reason, when explaining the man who was lame rose up instead of just arose, because Jesus said, "Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven or to say this man arise?" Then he said to the man, "Arise." Then the man arose. That would have been annoying. So no, Jesus said arise. So he rose up. Add some variation to the words being used. And he stretched it, Mark, only out. And then from Matthew only is the semicolon, not a colon. "And it was restored whole." Mark says, "and his hand was restored whole." Well, I definitely want to say his hand, not just it, even though they say it earlier. Luke, "and his hand was restored whole." Well, that's perfect, because that's what I want to do anyway. So gray for all three, and his hand is Mark, Luke. Mark, was restored whole. Was restored whole, Matthew. Luke, was restored whole. All three, the whole thing was restored whole. Luke continues, "as the other," Mark, "as the other," Matthew, "like as the other." So I'll do that. Like, and then all three, "as the other," period.